I suppose you might think that I am a complete idiot, the blindest, most stupid of husbands. But the thing is, firstly, hindsight is always smart. But beyond that, like most happily married men, I loved and trusted my wife. I was completely unaware that the woman I loved and cherished for 8 years, with whom I shared so much intimacy and so many happy memories, was a selfish monster. Or, to be more precise, one of the 3 selfish monsters. Molly's 2 sisters have been a fact of my life, practically from the very first date we met. I'd never met identical triplets before, and it was both unsettling and exciting to see 3 who looked alike. Or rather, 3 gorgeously alike, when I went to pick Molly up at her apartment. We met at the grocery store when she asked me to reach the top shelf for some herbal tea that she couldn't get to. Molly is just 157 cm tall, curvy, and voluptuous, with jet black hair that she wears short around her ears. I'm slightly taller than 183 centimeters, so I was the natural person she turned to for help. It wasn't until our 4th date that I found out that she had seen me in the produce section, thought I was cute, and had been waiting patiently by the herbal tea for me to come over to ask for help. It was quite flattering, I tell you. What was even better was that when she told me about it, she was lying naked in my arms, and we had just finished making love for the first time. Our first couple dates were absolutely wonderful. We went to dinner and talked until almost 11 p.m. We walked in the park and fed the ducks. We went to a pretty cheesy chick flick and held hands throughout the entire movie. Pretty corny, right? But I was amazed, fascinated, and bewitched. Molly was the most beautiful girl I had ever met. Sexy, in a good way, the girl next door, with a smile that could melt the heart of an IRS auditor. After I got her tea, she chatted amiably with me, letting me think I was filming her. And I was absolutely delighted when I headed to the checkout with a date set for the following Friday. She said something vague about having sisters, but I was not prepared for 3 beautiful Mollys when one of them opened the door and said, "Hello, you must be Scott." I was tongue-tied. "And you aren't Molly?" She laughed, just as charmingly as Molly had when we talked at the grocery store, and said, "No, I'm Hannah. Molly, Amy, and I are triplets. Didn't she mention us?" "Yes, I probably did, but for some reason I haven't heard anything about the twins." Hannah laughed again. "Molly does that sometimes. She just has a little fun at your expense. I'll go get her. Come in." There was another Molly in the living room, but of course, it was Amy. They all had the same haircuts, the same figures, and the same dazzling smiles, so I had no chance of knowing who was who until Molly came out of one of the bedrooms and said, "Hello, Scott. Would you like a nice cup of herbal tea?" During our first dinner, we talked about everything under the sun, but spent a lot of time focusing on Molly's life as triplets. I was fascinated and wanted to know everything about what it was like. Does she like to constantly see herself in 2 other faces? Were they closer than most siblings? Could they almost read each other's minds, like identical twins should be able to? Have they ever changed their identities to deceive people? "I don't know if we read each other's minds," Molly told me, "but we are very close. I feel like I can almost always tell what Ami or Hannah is thinking, and they often do the same thing, like answer a question I haven't had a chance to ask yet. We've always been like this. As for deceiving other people," she stopped and smiled at me, "I think we've done that kind of thing a little. Have you noticed that we all wear the same hairstyles?" I nodded, and she continued. "As little girls, we loved to fool people. Our elementary school teachers, relatives, even our parents. They also couldn't tell us apart, surprisingly. It was a lot of fun, especially when Amy or Hannah got into trouble and wanted to avoid a spanking. "No, Dad, I'm not Amy, I'm Molly." She grinned. You can imagine how it happened. Mom and Dad must have gone crazy. Then in high school, we all wanted to be different. For a while, we were really annoyed that people kept confusing us. So we wore different hairstyles, went to different classes, and did different activities. For example, I was on the yearbook staff, Amy wrote for the newspaper, and Hannah played field hockey. But after a few years, we began to lack interchangeability. So we returned to external similarity. Every now and then, I would take a chemistry test for Amy, or Hannah would do an oral presentation for me. It helped us all a little with our grades, you know? She grinned. And there was one time when Brad Hendricks asked Amy out on a date during our junior year. She was crazy about him. And when she came down with the flu on the morning of their date, she was beside herself. She cried and moaned, saying that he would never ask her out again if she canceled it. In the end, she convinced me to be her for one evening. It wasn't hard because it was their first date, and they didn't know each other very well anyway. Starting with date number 2, Amy took over again, and they dated for almost a year. She never told him that I was her stunt double. Years later, of course, I recalled this story with a great deal of bitterness. But as I said, at that time I was sitting at the table opposite a beautiful, cheerful, charming girl. I was already crazy about her. And the fact that she seemed to like me too was incredible, like a miracle. The 3 girls had gone off to college and were enjoying living on their own. But they also missed each other. So after college, all 3 moved back to Cincinnati. They found a large shared apartment, and that's where I went to pick Molly up for our date, where I first met her sisters. So we can fast forward 8 years. Molly and I dated, fell in love, and got married 2 years later. I considered myself the happiest person on planet Earth. I had a job at a graphic design firm, and since I had more computer experience than the older guys who ran the place, I was a valuable commodity, so I made good money. We could easily afford a nice 3-bedroom house in Oakley Square, just a few miles from our work in the city center. And I think you won't be surprised to know who our neighbors were. 3 years after Molly and I got married, Amy married a tall, rather boring guy named Ted, who worked in finance. He was quite friendly, just not very interesting. Anyway, they lived next door to us, at the end of a little dead-end street called Ferdinand Place. Amy and Ted's yard overlooked the backyard of the house on Oak Park Place. And guess who lived there? Sorry, you won't get any points because it was too easy. Hannah, of course, with her husband Arnold. Arnie was the complete opposite of Ted. He was several years older than us, a short, cheerful guy who owned several bowling alleys in the Cincinnati area. He smoked cigars until Hannah made him quit, told funny, often raunchy jokes, and was terrific company. They got married a few months before Amy and Ted. It was no surprise to any of the 3 husbands that our wives insisted on living so close to each other. They were almost like Siamese triplets, joined at the hips. Ted, Arnie, and I were used to them finishing each other's sentences or seeming to say the same thing at the same time. We've also become accustomed to their need to get together every evening, and I mean practically every night, to chat before bed. They would meet in one of our 3 kitchens around 9:30 or 10 p.m., chat a little, and then each go home to her husband. Even after 8 years of living with Molly, I could never be completely sure which one was the triplets, and Ted and Arnie admitted that they had the same problem. We have all become very good at noticing what clothes each wife is wearing, or who is wearing a particular necklace or earrings. As we celebrated Christmas with Pam and Donald, their parents, it became clear that they had as much difficulty distinguishing between their daughters as we did. This does not mean that their characters were the same. Amy was a little tough, a little more prim and conservative than her 2 sisters. Hannah, on the other hand, was wild. She drank a little more, told more dirty jokes, and would certainly be voted most likely to be a topless bar dancer of the 3 sisters, although I don't think she ever did. My Molly was in between, and I thought she was perfect, sweeter and more outgoing than Amy, but more level-headed than Hannah. So it's not that you didn't notice the differences between the sisters when we all spent time together. Rather, it was that you could not tell by or voice which one was which. In another way, it can be said this way: when they wanted to deceive you, you had no chance. Since neither of us had children yet, the vacation was easy to plan. As you may have guessed, Molly and her sisters demanded that the 6 of us vacation together. So every summer, we took 2 weeks and went somewhere interesting. Las Vegas or a beach resort in North Carolina, or Italy for 1 year. We were a fairly compatible group, so the husbands didn't mind. But in exchange, I insisted on going away with Molly for a week every year. Just the two of us. No Amy, no Hannah, no brothers-in-law. At first, this was a real point of contention, and there were some heated arguments and icy silences. Several times passed before Molly realized that I was completely serious. In fact, it took 3 years before everything fell into place. I love your sisters, and I have fun with Arnie and Ted, but I wish I had time just for us. Is it really that hard to understand? This is my deal. You get a 2-week trip with all of us every year, and I get 1 week with you alone. I must have given that speech 10 times. But it wasn't until the day before the trip to Italy, when Molly came home from work and saw that I hadn't even started to pack, that she gave up. That was the argument. But I firmly said that if she did not agree to spend a week with me, I would stay at home. She and 2 other couples can go to Italy without me. More than an hour of screaming passed, all without my participation, and about 20 phone calls to Amy and Hannah. Both sisters came to help Molly calm me down, but I did not give in. They were happy to explain to me over and over again how selfish and short-sighted I was acting, and that no loving husband would be so adamant, etc. In the end, Molly agreed to my demand, and we went to Italy. But for a few days, it was pretty cold between us, and her sisters joined her to make sure I knew I was in the kennel. If it weren't for the encouragement of Arnie and Ted, who secretly rejoiced at my victory because it meant they would receive the same proposals from their wives, I might have given up and flown home early. But by about the 5th day, the romance and beauty of Florence had softened Molly, and the rest of the trip was amazing, like our week on Sanibel Island next winter. After that, every year we spent 2 wonderful weeks with Molly's sisters and 1 wonderful week without them. So what's the problem? This all sounds absolutely amazing, right? And so it was. The problem arose when we started trying to have children. Molly and I knew we'd have them someday, but we were enjoying life as a couple, or as a couple glued to 2 other couples. Too much to rush it. But when she and her sisters turned 30 and I was 32, the biological clock began to tick. She stopped taking the pills, and within a couple of months, Molly and I started making a baby. I had no objection to the goal or the process of achieving it. I have always loved sex with my beautiful, amazing wife. Our sex life was most often intimate and tender, rather than rough and wild. We had 3 or 4 favorite positions, and the nights where we spent extra time being playful or creative became fewer and fewer over the years, as I think happens with most married couples. Molly would surprise me from time to time. She would come into bed very horny and much more aggressive, and we would have sex several times a night. We always drank champagne on birthdays or anniversaries, and it always made her even more excited. But mostly everything was more tender and loving, and that suited me. One night after she had just raped me, I joked with her about it and discovered that she didn't like it at all. It was Saturday, and when I returned from the grocery store with food for dinner, I heard her calling me from the bedroom, where I found her lying naked on her stomach on the bed, holding a bottle of massage oil. "I'm a little stressed today, cowboy," she muttered. "Do you think you could help me?" It was amazing. I worked her back and legs thoroughly as she moaned contentedly. Then I turned her over and worked her over, first with my fingers, and then much longer with my lips and tongue, until she climaxed 3 times. Then we had sex, hard, until I finished in ecstasy. For some time, we lay dreamily together. Molly went into the kitchen and brought us some snacks. Dinner seemed off the agenda. And soon we were tumbling around again. When we caught our breath smiling at each other, I said, "Wow, that was something, Molly." Then I pretended to be deep in thought. Or wait, maybe you're not Molly. Maybe I just got really lucky with Amy or Hannah tonight. I'm not sure Molly has ever been this excited. She couldn't help but understand that I was joking. But instead of a grin or a retaliatory barb, I received a cold look. "Scott, this is not funny. How could you think that I would ever do something like that?" Do you really think that I will ever share you with my sisters?" As she glared at me, I felt the temperature in the room drop by about 10 degrees. "Molly, forgive me," I said. "I was just joking, honey." I reached out to hug her, but she pulled away from me and stood up. "I'm going to take a shower," she said, still clearly angry with me, and disappeared into the bathroom. I heard the lock click behind her. For the rest of the night and most of the next day, I remained unnoticed. Molly seemed determined to make it clear that some things were not to be joked about. Finally, at dinner on Sunday, I apologized again, repeating that it was just a harmless joke, and she seemed to relax a little. That evening, she let me snuggle up behind her in bed, and I breathed a sigh of relief. I didn't like it when Molly got mad at me, and I made a mental note to never joke about switching sisters again, although it seemed funny that she would react so strongly to it. On our first date, she told me a story about taking Amy's place on a date with a high school student, and I remembered an incident a few weeks before our wedding when this topic came up again. Molly and I disagreed over something small, like which hotel we should stay at for our honeymoon in Curacao. I, of course, gave in to her, but during our humorous argument, I suggested that if she didn't want me, then perhaps I would marry one of her sisters. Then she joked back to me, "I don't think they'll take you, baby. Both Amy and Hannah aren't very deep sleepers, and I told them you snore sometimes. This will be a deal breaker. Better stay with me." "Rats," I answered. "Okay, if I can't have Amy or Hannah, then I guess I'll still marry you." And that was the end of it. So I had absolutely no idea why, a few years later, she got so angry when I made the same joke. In any case, as I already said, it was the birth of a child, or rather our attempt to have a child, that turned my life upside down. We tried and enjoyed it. About 10 months. I had heard of many couples who took a year or two to get pregnant, so I wasn't worried at all. But Molly became increasingly concerned about the lack of success, and she insisted that I go to our doctor and get checked. So I did. I had fun sitting in a small room with adult magazines and getting tested, and then waiting for the phone call a few days later. It happened on Friday while I was at work. I closed my office door and talked with Dr. Rendell for a couple of minutes. "Well, Scott, you have nothing to worry about," he said. "The sperm count is slightly lower than normal. It is about 70% of the average for men at the age of 30, but there is nothing to worry about. Your sperm are healthy and strong, just not as many. You and Molly should have no trouble conceiving, but it may take a little longer than some couples." This was good news, and I was looking forward to getting home and calming Molly down. But for some reason, it slipped my mind. At dinner, we had a long conversation about the politics of the city of Cincinnati, and I forgot about it. The topic came back to me, only at almost 23 o'clock. That evening, the sisters' usual gatherings took place in our kitchen. I watched basketball on TV and then went to bed. I often fell asleep before Molly got up. But just as I was about to drift off, the news about my sperm count came back to me, and I felt like I had to tell Molly immediately. So I grabbed my robe and headed downstairs, deciding that I would interrupt the conversation in the kitchen to tell Molly that we had nothing to worry about. As I walked through the living room towards the kitchen, I heard a burst of boisterous laughter from the three sisters through the closed swing door. I smiled to myself, thinking for the 100th time about how much they were enjoying each other's company, and instead of heading straight to the kitchen, I paused for a moment to eavesdrop on their conversation. It was completely innocent, I swear. I just couldn't help but be curious about what they were chatting about so cheerfully. I didn't have the slightest idea what I was about to hear. Voice number 1. "Well, if he's not the best, why do you always want to change with me?" Voice number 2, giggling. "I didn't say that Arnie isn't the best. I just said that he doesn't caress private parts as skillfully as Scott does." Voice number 3. Or is it still number 2? I can't tell. "Besides, you greedy cow, you still get Arnie more nights every week than any of us." "Plus the weekend," another voice interrupted. "So you probably shouldn't complain about your situation." More laughter. I stood there in complete shock. To say, I couldn't believe what I heard is an understatement. I couldn't believe it. Change? Having sex with each other's husbands? I quietly sat down on a chair, trying to come to my senses, and again tuned into the conversation. Almost a year, and I just don't think Scott can do the job. It must be Molly, I thought. So you have a plan B? Yes, if his spermogram does not return to normal. He got tested about a week ago, so we should know at any moment now. How are we going to do this? No problem. I'll just spend a few nights with Ted when I'm most fertile. Either way, it's a little boring being with Scott every night. And at the end of the cycle, when I'm safe, I want to spend a couple of nights with Arnie. Under no circumstances, Maul. This is not foolproof. You won't get Arnie again until you're pregnant. Laughter. It was too early for my shock to turn into anger. I tried my best not to believe the only conclusion I could draw from what I heard. Molly intended to let Ted get pregnant with his child. I realized that Ted and I were very similar, even though he was 3-4 inches taller. We had the same hair and eye color and general body type, unlike Arnie, who was shorter and heavier. I sat motionless, terrified, on a chair in a dark living room, experiencing the sudden end of my happy marriage. I could barely think, and then it dawned on me that the coffee clutch in the kitchen was falling apart. I quietly retreated to the bedroom, where I jumped back into bed and lay motionless. As stunned as I was, I knew I could never confront Molly without thinking first. And anyway, who knew which sister would come to sleep with me? So I calmed my breathing, and when a few minutes later one of the girls slid into bed, she assumed I was already asleep. I felt a gentle kiss on my cheek, and her soft voice said, "I love you, baby," as Molly often did before bed. It was all I could do not to jump up and scream at her, "Oh, you cheating slut! Then how do you explain that you're having sex with 2 of my brothers-in-law?" But I lay still, controlling my breathing. I waited for her to fall asleep. Planning. After a few minutes, I heard Molly's, or whoever's, breathing become slow and regular. But I waited a full hour to be absolutely sure she was asleep before getting out of bed. I thought about how they could pull this off and immediately realized that it wouldn't be difficult at all. If they changed husbands just for sex, they would change clothes during evening meetings. They all worked part-time as co-managers of the interior design store, so none of them left the house in the morning before Arnie, Ted, and me. Changing clothes in the morning would be easy. The only difficulty could be weekends. Either we were sleeping with our own wives on the weekends, I thought, or they were making arrangements to switch to another day. But it would still be possible, since the 6 of us would have a barbecue, brunch, or some kind of get-together almost every weekend, and if not, a quick trip to my sister to pick up the catalog she prepared for me, or under some other pretext. No, figuring out the how wasn't difficult. I was puzzled by the why. You might think that we husbands would have known the difference. I mean, can't you tell your own wife from another woman, for God's sake? But here's the thing. We had no reason to be suspicious. We had no doubt, or at least I had no doubt before, about the identity of the woman in my bed. And there was something else, I realized. Early in our marriage, Molly and I loved to lie in bed at night and just talk, either before or after or instead of sex. We talked about our relationship, about our plans for the future, about work, about our families, about everything. But everything has changed. I don't know exactly when, but a few years earlier, Molly began to discourage late-night conversations. She would come into the bedroom after hanging out with her sisters, and we would just go to bed. We may or may not have had sex, but any conversations I tried to initiate were met with, "I'm very tired, honey. Let's talk about this tomorrow." In fact, for years, all of our important conversations, anything we said about our days or plans for the future, took place during dinner or earlier in the evening, never late at night in bed. This was probably a deliberate strategy. Since women switched partners, the less conversation there was, the less likely it was that the wife would be caught not knowing something she should or not remembering something from the past. Once I was sure Molly was asleep, I snuck into the office, found the ink pad we used to stamp our checking accounts, and dropped some permanent black ink on the tip of my finger. Then, back in the bedroom, I carefully made a small mark on her back, on the right side, about halfway between her shoulder blade and shoulder. It was no bigger than a pencil eraser, and she would never have noticed it if she hadn't looked at her back in the mirror. I went to the bathroom and washed my finger with warm water and soap. As I expected, the ink remained. Even vigorous washing only removed some of it. I worked the pumice stone on my finger for a while longer until what was left was so dull that no one could see it. Climbing back into bed, I smiled grimly to myself as I contemplated my next steps. The worst of the shock had passed, and I was deeply angry. If what I understood from the women's conversation was accurate, Molly had betrayed me, thoroughly and systematically, perhaps over many years. She and her sisters put themselves and their common bond above the duty of love and faithfulness that they allowed to their husbands. I felt used, deceived, humiliated. I tried to imagine how all this could be fixed, but I didn't see any way.